I think people are looking for on-ramps or pathways into the Enneagram when they learn their type. It's like, okay, what do I do with this? I'm Beatrice Chestnut, and I'm the co-author of the Enneagram Guide to Waking Up.
I am Uranio Paes, and I am the co-author of the Enneagram Guide to Waking Up.
So Uranio and I first met at a conference of the International Enneagram Association. And later we were both invited to be on the board of directors of the International Enneagram Association.
2002, right?
We met in 2002. Yeah. And we both went on the board of that organization in 2004, and we were there from 2004 to the end of 2009. And then I think we both worked more in our local community, but we reconnected in 2013 at another International Enneagram Association conference and stayed in good touch after that and reconnected, further grew our friendship to the point where we decided we wanted to work together. We wanted to try teaching together, and that went really well. So starting in 2017, we started what is today the Chestnut Paes Enneagram Academy.
I believe that since the very beginning, when Bea and I met, we had a common identity and a very good common ground when it comes to the Enneagram, but also in how to work with the Enneagram and how to spread it to people and what kind of things to do with it. But mostly developmental work, combining psychology and spirituality. So it wasn't difficult at all for us to start discussing common projects and things we could do together. And we are also very complementary in styles, but also in backgrounds and things we did in life. So it was always a pleasure to learn from Bea and to sum up strengths. And then lately we started actually thinking of CP as two programs that were aiming to go beyond workshops, to do workshops or retreats together, but as part of programs, one being a personal mastery program and the other one being a professional certification program. So the former for inner development and the latter for outer impact. But then it expanded also naturally to becoming a whole academy with a lot of online content, CP Online, with tests, also with mentors and therapists and coaches connected to us and helping in the programs, also with advanced retreats, the podcast, and more.
So I think from the beginning of when Uranio and I knew each other, I think what we had in common was a really strong commitment to putting the Enneagram out there in the world for as many people as possible to use in a high quality way, in a way where it was used as we believe it was intended, as something that's really deep and powerful in creating transformation. So I think we always were kind of a team. Like when we worked on the board of directors, we were sort of always on the same side because that's the side we were on. It's like, how can we do the best job we can of putting the Enneagram out there in the best, most ethical, deepest ways so that people aren't using it superficially, but that they really know what this is and they use it well. I think the way we're complementary is in both our backgrounds and our personality and temperament. So you worked a lot in business. I've worked some in business, but I spent a lot of my career as a psychotherapist. So I come at it more from the depth psychotherapy point of view, and you came at first from the point of view of doing a lot of work with leaders and teams and organizations. But then, of course, you've also done some really deep spiritual work on different spiritual growth paths. And I haven't spent time doing that sort of in-depth spiritual work in a spiritual community in the same way you have. So I think you bring those things, and I bring the psychotherapy and also the academic background, because I started off in academics. And so I think we have these different parts of our backgrounds that come together and bring a lot to the table when you look at what we both bring. And then, of course, you're a head type and I'm a heart type. I naturally sort of connect with people emotionally, and you have a brilliant mind, and you're a great visionary and very creative, and I'm very practical. So I think there are a lot of different ways that we complement each other in working together.
And meaning that I'm not very practical. And but I really, I think I allow myself to have visions of potentials and more. However, I think our complementary goes even beyond all this, and I think they covered most of it. But it goes to the point of the specific way we access intuition that is very different for both of us, and that ends up being really good for our students. The different ways that we communicate with students in, at times B comes across to some students more than I do, and then vice versa to some other students. Also, the kind of work we had been doing before we joined forces, like I was working a lot with energy in taking the Enneagram to people and working experientially with an Enneagram mat, among other experiential things. And B had been studying really hard some approaches on the Enneagram and spreading the word of what she believed, and I believe now, was the correct take in subtypes and types and so on. And she had been writing books. I had been doing an online platform with content, so it was very natural for us to join forces.
Well, we were actually approached by a publisher who really wanted to publish an Enneagram book that would have a broad reach, that would bring people in, an accessible book. He felt like there wasn't really a book out there that would be short enough, easy to understand enough, and relatable enough to really appeal to a wide audience, so that many people could gain access to all the Enneagram has to offer. And he really pressed us to make it simple and accessible. And I had been wanting to write a book like that, because when I wrote The Complete Enneagram, I had sort of wanted it to be all things to all people. I wanted it to be both an introduction and a book that had a lot of substantive content for people who had been studying the Enneagram for a while to take their learning deeper. But I sort of had to let go of the real introductory audience, because it got long and it was very substantive. And so I think sometimes for someone who's brand new to psychology or personal development, the Complete Enneagram can be a little bit of a heavy lift. So I was really wanting to write a book and really looking forward to the challenge of writing a book that was more basic, more introductory, that could bring people in. It was like an entry point for more and more people who haven't heard about the Enneagram, but can, through reading this book, really know all there is to know about how to launch their growth path. And what I like about the approach we took with this book, which is also something I had wanted to do, was to write a book that in a simple, clear way answered the question, okay, when I know my type, now what do I do? And so instead of focusing on descriptions of the 9 types, It really focuses much more on the growth path for the 9 types, and it simplifies the growth path into a 3-step journey, so that you can really have an actionable way to further your self-development using the Enneagram. It's something that's easy, that isn't too difficult to understand at first if you're new, but can also be really entertaining and I think fun even for people who do know the Enneagram well. It really highlights what the work is to be done for each of the types.
There was a certain moment that B and I looked at each other and realized, the Enneagram is being now introduced by us in a very different way than we used to do many, many years ago. We have updated the Enneagram theory and practice and the way to share it with other people quite a lot. So when we realized that, I think that this guy became very natural. We should give birth to something like this. It was about time for the Enneagram community to have a new introductory Enneagram book with at least what we consider to be the more updated take in Enneagram theory.
Right, so it's both introductory, but it doesn't sugarcoat the growth path. It says, here's this amazing tool that can help you gain more access to understanding yourself, but it also doesn't shy away from saying, here's the challenge that you need to really face. Here's what you need to really understand about yourself. Part of the subtitle is Face Your Shadow. So one of the things the Enneagram does really well is it helps us see our blind spots. So we wanted to really emphasize that as part of the Enneagram-based journey that people can take.
I hold a very great deal of gratitude for some Enneagram teachers who were pioneers in America when writing the first books, when doing the first teachings and creating the first schools. And my understanding is that they had a very hard time because they were doing that right after a lot of pushback to the encounter movement in California and the more alternative approaches that perhaps went a bit too far away at times. And so they did the work they did in an era that everybody was being asked to do more gentle work and gentle approaches. However, being a Brazilian and South American myself, I don't think that I come from a culture that experienced as much pushback from that, and I believe I benefited a bit more quickly perhaps from approaches that were truly aiming to deconstruct ego, aiming to go a little deeper and at times confront a bit more our personalities and ego. And I think it's silly to just put these two things as being oppositional. We need both. We need both acceptance, gradual approaches at times, careful when dealing with wounds, and gentleness and love, but we also need a more assertive position to go against ego. Otherwise, people will just feel very happy with the Enneagram work from an ego perspective. They will be too comfortable in doing work that shouldn't be that comfortable. And what we try to do at CP, and that shows in our book, is a combination of both methods. Also, we came to understand lately that there are moments when these approaches make more sense. In a certain level of awareness, all we need is this gentler approach, and then on another level of awareness that we sometimes get to later on, we need more confrontation. And if we don't go there, we will stay stuck. So I've always been a little disappointed to see too many friends on the path getting stuck on their own self-development paths because they did not allow for a bit more confrontational work. And I think this is a time when we are being invited to bring these two together. And they can both operate very beautiful things if they are both based in love.
So I think I know I wanted the title, The Enneagram Guide to Waking Up, because I think the Enneagram is all about awakening. It's all about recognizing that when we're identified with our personality, it's a little bit like we're sleepwalking through life, but we don't realize it. And so I wanted something in the title that said, the Enneagram helps you wake up. So that was the title. And then I really liked the subtitle because it mirrors the 3-step growth path that we clarify for each of the 9 types in the book. So for each of the 9 types, the growth path is to find your path, which is about finding your type and starting to recognize and observe some of the main, more conscious patterns that go along with your type. But then the next step is to face your shadow. The next step is to see what you don't tend to see, to make unconscious patterns more conscious. And the third step is to really aim for the higher side, to recognize the Enneagram is a tool that helps us grow not only psychologically but also spiritually. And what does that mean? And that true growth and transformation comes not when you, as Uranio said, not when you make the personality better, more functional, you make the ego happier. It's when you rise above the whole thing, when you disidentify with the personality type that you've mistakenly identified with, and go to a higher level of consciousness. And so discovering your true self is the third part of that journey.
The expression waking up in the book's title refers to the fact that B and I believe that that's the mission of the Enneagram, to truly help people waking up rather than just finding out what their personalities are. We sometimes say that the main reason to find out what our personality is on the Enneagram is to learn how to not limit ourselves to it, to go beyond it, to expand from it to other levels of being and levels of awareness. So the book title, we wanted to be reflective of the work we do, which is pretty much developmental and not only an illustration of how people behave when in personality or in a limited level of awareness, but rather what the paths are. And when talking about each type, we already talk about that path. Like for a 2, like B, it's the path from pride to humility, or for me as a 5, is the path from avarice to non-attachment. So it's not only about our egos. When we were writing the chapters, B came up with an idea that I thought was brilliant and that I was too biased to have it. I mean, she as a heart type just understood that people needed to relate more personally with what we were talking about, and from a perspective of their life's journeys. As a 5, I want to read more about theory itself, but then B came up with this great idea of tales for each type, stories that cover the person's journey from early childhood. Right,
we wanted an interesting and compelling way for the person to enter into each type and each chapter about each type. And actually an editor friend of mine who was helping me sort of in the beginning stages of the book kind of figure out how they would go, how each chapter would go, she suggested I write a kind of archetypal story. And so I had the idea to say, yeah, it would be interesting to think about a person called 2 or called 5 or called 8. And so I thought, what if I wrote just a very archetypal like overview of how this type evolves starting in childhood. Now, the tricky thing is we're not saying that type forms in childhood. We're actually saying we're born with our type, and then things tend to play out in a certain way when we apply our coping strategy that goes with the type that we're born with. So we tried to kind of say that each type is born in almost kind of a spiritually connected way, in a way where they come into the human world sort of having to cope with a lower level of awareness, and how the experience of that type tends to evolve given their main defenses, and how that actually leads to them falling asleep. We use the metaphor of the zombie in the book to kind of say, you're more asleep than you think you are, you're actually walking around like a zombie, and that's a way of really portraying this idea that you're not as aware and awake and alive as you think you are, or as you are capable of being. So this archetypal story is just a way to kind of summarize the type in an interesting way from the start of the chapter, so people can get a flavor of the type, and especially the way what its survival strategy is basically, and how that survival strategy kind of shapes the person's experience. Well, I think one challenge was writing a book together when we were in different locations and couldn't actually be in the same room writing together or discussing ideas. And it was very much having to go back and forth, having an iterative process with the writing, which, actually also isn't that hard. But that was one thing, I think, not being in the same place.
Another challenge is that I think that because English is not my first language, I thought it was better than it was. Actually, when I wrote, I found out that B would edit me quite a lot. Not in content, but in how I say things. But she did edit a lot. But when it came to the stories, it was even more challenging, because I thought I had written very great stories, and she edited, she erased all of them and wrote them on her style, which I actually think that for the stories is better.
Although there are a few stories that your original version is pretty much still there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Another challenge was that our very good editor was pressing us for time. And I think that not only that, but both B and I have this tendency to go deeper and to write more and to give more information and to never stop. So making it more concise was always a dream. And we had a certain number of words to write for a chapter, and it was like twice as much, or then 50%. And then we had an illusion that we would be able to negotiate with our editors for some more. But it worked out well.
Yeah, I would say that was one of the biggest challenges, is that it's really hard for me to write something short, and I think that's true for you too. Yeah. There's that Mark Twain quote, something like, "I'm sorry I didn't have time to write you a shorter letter." And I feel like that's the story of me as a writer. I have to write this much to get down to this much. And so we gave our publisher many more words than he had asked for or that we had agreed to, and he was generous in giving us more words than he really wanted. But he also helped us do a developmental edit where we made it more concise. And I like the idea of it being concise. Of course, it's a challenge because I think you and I are always seeing all the complexities involved, and so it's hard for us to really say things in as few words as possible because we always see that there's more to say.
Especially because we still wanted it to have all main parts of theory,
right,
including subtypes and arrows and more, and we didn't want it to be shallow at all.
Yeah.
And having an introductory but not shallow book in a certain amount of words wasn't that easy.
Yes, exactly. And making it simple. I wanted it to be simple and yet profound.
Yeah.
But again, we have a hard time not being complex and not adding in more, not saying, oh, and there's this and there's this. And so I think one big challenge was really, I can't believe how thin it is because it's hard.
We also talk about essence a little bit, virtues.
Yeah.
So it was a complex thing, but we made it.
Right. And I think the publisher helped us a lot by, for instance, he himself really suggested a much shorter introduction, for instance, and of course we want to give all the information. But hopefully we got the right balance of content, but in a concise, precise way. That's fun to read.
So Beatrice Chestnut, congratulations on the book, on the Enneagram Guide to Waking Up. You did an excellent job.
And congratulations
so many things.
to you too. It was a pleasure to partner with you in this project, and I hope it helps a lot of people. And it's out October 1st in the US and November 1st in the UK and other places.